Yo, look at this. You're gonna check this out. You see these buildings? This is what I recorded when I was on the train in China. Just focus on those residential buildings. Do you see the problem with them? Let me show you some more footage. First, those buildings in the distance, and then this whole housing block in the background. I don't know if you realize, but all these buildings are one-to-one replicas of each other. The same principle applies to these massive glass high-rises as well. This at first doesn't seem strange because usually buildings in one apartment block are built in the same way. But this similarity don't only apply to buildings that are in each other's proximity. A lot of Chinese cities are filled with blocks of houses that look completely same, or their architectural structures, or even their vibes are just pretty much the same. And this doesn't only apply to residential buildings. So it seems like many Chinese cities are experiencing a standardizing process, something that is making them characterless. And it's quite strange because if you're in China, you will definitely come across either quite unique or pretty buildings. But all these sites also feel similar. They are quite artificial. You can sense that they were built there for an audience, not something that was made through an organic process. They're only there for show, functioning as a spectacle. So the Chinese urban landscape is diverting into two areas, either bleak, copy-pasted housing blocks, or super grandiose spectacles without any kind of soul to them. And after seeing all this in person, it made me wonder how a China with its decades of economic miracle, lifting people out of poverty and rising to the ranks of a global superpower, how can their urban design be so characterless? So I dug myself into this question, reading through all the limited amount of sources that was on this topic. And with spending weeks on research, understanding the connections between different kind of disciplines, I was able to come up with a long ass script that tells you this story. A story that tells us about the tension between relentless chase towards modernity and the preservation of culture. A story that shows the cost of economic growth. And the story that shows how China's urban development issues are deeply tied with globalization and the global flow of capital that are causing hard to solve policy dilemmas not only in China but across the world. In order to understand why there are certain sets of urban designs across China, we gotta go back in time for a little bit. And to be more exact, we have to go back to something that's a root cause of many other things, which is communism. So after the Second World War, when communism started to take power even outside the Soviet Union, when the so-called Eastern Bloc was formed, the economies of these countries that turned into communist states has fundamentally changed. There were so-called central plans that determined for the next 5 years what type of economic outputs each sector or industry should make. And these industries and sectors were segmented into so-called work units, which basically is a categorization for people who do the same profession. So for example, farmers, steel manufacturers, constructors, they all have their own separate work units. And these work units basically function as like a production unit. And for each of these production units, there was an assigned goal by the end of the 5 year that they had to achieve. So these economies shifted away from like a market model where market forces and market dynamics were deciding on pricing and output and productivity. Instead, in this case, the state just determined that this is the amount of stuff that we need and you need to make that amount. And this is a very common thing across all communist countries. So same with China. China had a work unit that was basically bunching together a lot of architectural designers. So for these architectural design work units, the most important thing was reaching the actual goal that the government has set out. And because of that, practicality had utmost importance, while aesthetics was basically just put aside. And we might think now that, oh yeah, well, China is still a communist country, right? So maybe that's the reason why they're still creating the same type of buildings. This is close, but still not there yet. Because unit housing was also a thing in Western countries. Unit houses were basically those affordable, identical buildings that were built en masse with like high density in order to house as many people as possible. They were fast to build and usually cheap to maintain. And they were usually a response to either the damages suffered during the Second World War, or with the rapidly urbanizing society and a growing population, people just had to find somewhere to live. And this was the easiest way to expand capacity. And these also lack design, just like any other communist housing block. There were a lot of unit housing construction happening across the world, especially during the period of the 40s up until the 70s. But after the 70s, things changed and there was a shift towards more unique and aesthetically pleasing designs. However, this shift didn't really affect China to the same degree. And this feels also quite contradictory to the fact that during the 70s, Deng Xiaoping, the then leader of China, has also opened up the Chinese economy towards global commerce, which led to a huge amount of privatization, commercialization, foreign direct investments, and so much more capitalistic tendencies that were not really imaginable in a communist state. While land was still in the hand of the central government, and that was leased by private development companies who then constructed buildings on top. And these companies were obviously prioritizing returns, and with a Chinese population that still didn't really have much disposable income and affordability was a very important issue, it was much more easier to build identical buildings, forfeiting the idea of making super interesting and unique designs because it wasn't a worthwhile cost to spend money on. So even after the economy has opened up in China, the state still had a huge say. In fact, the central government and even local governments became so-called entrepreneurial states, which meant that governments themselves became participants within the market, and they were guided by certain market principles as well. For example, maximizing economic growth. And this is best shown by the creation of so-called SOEs, state-owned enterprises, where there was a huge majority of ownership by some kind of public entity into that given enterprise, and that entity functioned as if it was a private company in the sphere of the market, but obviously still governed by central national interests. Through these entities, the government was still able to maintain an oversight over the economy, even though it operated in the realm of like capitalism. For example, many times private developers have to make partnerships with these SOEs in order to gain access to a given land or to be on a given project. I've seen some projects like these when I visited China, most memorably the Taiguli projects, which has a version in Beijing and Chengdu. Both of them are basically a shopping area where you can eat, drink, and also buy different kind of clothing from foreign brands. Both of these areas were constructed by the same company called Swire Pacific, who had different kind of joint ventures with local SOEs in order to build both of these development projects. And it seems like even with private company participation, urban designs can still end up to be quite similar. If you look at both of these places, there are certain pathways and building allocations that are just one-on-one copies of each other. But now you get the point. The state still has a big role in terms of determining how urban planning and urban design should happen. And even the structures from the communist era still didn't disappear. The state still creates plans in order to give guidelines to local governments in terms of what type of economic output it is looking for. And also with that, their expectations in terms of how infrastructure should improve, what type of urban designs, urban developments should be put into place. And the central government distills down these guidelines across a pyramid structure. So if you imagine on top there's central government, below we have provincial, the municipal, and then local governments. And each one that is on the top is the boss of the ones below them. And each of the layers kind of determine certain guidelines that the ones below them have to follow. And in this way, a whole government structure will be formed where practicality and functionality will be the most important driver of making decisions. Ever since the opening of the Chinese economy, these guidelines have been always focused on one crucial thing, which is maintaining the economic growth that China has seen in the last few decades. That's why each of the levels will be focusing on how to maximize economic output and reach those type of targets that their given bosses above them are looking for. Basically, the state became a super practical and functionalist entity that focused on economic goals. Once again, showing how it kind of shaped into an entrepreneurial state. And if we think about all the layers of this pyramid, these are all filled with people with certain type of own interests and alignments and goals. And for local leaders, one of the crucial things is that they want to climb the political career ladder, or at least they just want to keep their job. And in order to be there, they have to perform well enough and show that they're worthy of a better title, or at least to keep their current title. And this aspect mixed with another fact that Chinese local leaders were usually quite often rotated around different kind of regions. They have really short office terms when they had to make very important decisions for local communities. And because these people had the pressure to reach certain type of goals and outputs, they were focusing on how to maximize as much economic growth with the shortest amount of time. So quantitative metrics became the most important thing. So that's why quality and the aesthetics of urban design or just building construction were basically put at second order because they just didn't really serve the goal that they were looking to reach. And to put it very logically, the easiest way to reach certain goals is to take a standard way of doing things and replicate it, churn it out as much as possible, and this way you will reach those targets that your seniors are looking for. And that's why the creation of quite identical urban spaces and buildings still remained even after the super communistic period, because aesthetics and design was never really an important factor to consider. But now you might ask like, bro, what are you on? I've seen pictures in China, they look super cool, super modern. Some buildings have super intricate designs. Like, have you not seen the buildings in Shanghai? And bro, yes, I've seen these places, I've been to them, I've seen it with my own eyes. I'm not trying to say that China has no architectural creativity around building buildings, but one thing it's missing is kind of substance. When I see these spaces, I can clearly tell that it was made for you to see. It was a spectacle. It's not developed through an organic process. It was already built for an audience in mind. And another aspect is the fixation of building these super high-tech modern buildings is because they have some kind of a symbolism. Obviously, with decades of poverty and hardship, China wants to show itself now as a more modern player, a country that stands for the future. And especially with its huge economic growth and so much more potential in the future, it's very important to them to craft an image of the country that demonstrates modernity on the global stage. And that's why even if certain spaces are not identically made, they still are standardized in a manner that they want to showcase either the symbolism of modernity or they want to show some kind of a spectacle, something that is admirable, but it was purposefully built there. Whenever I travel to China, I personally experienced the outcomes of these historical events and these macro urban urban policies because they affect and influence areas that are very personal to me. For example, the areas where my grandparents live. Okay, quick pause. Let's take a quick break. I just wanted to first of all say thank you for all the support that I received for my 2 previous videos. I got a lot of kind comments and I'm honestly grateful that even there's some people actually sitting down and watching these videos. If you're interested in more socio-cultural or political economic topics like these, please follow for more. Go hit that subscribe button, even hit that bell thing if you want to. I've been dreaming about quitting my current corporate job and doing this for a living. So if you want to support me in that way, a subscribe would be super helpful. And also any type of feedback about what's good and what's not good about these videos, I'm happily taking them as well. Speaking of chasing dreams and quitting corporate jobs, I started a new series on my Instagram page about documenting my journey of becoming a full-time content creator by the end of 2025. And if you're interested in content creation, or if you're just interested in how to quit your 9-to-5, that might be the page for you as well to take a look. Honestly, thanks a lot guys for all the support, and let's go back to whatever we were talking about. In chase of a modern future, sadly a lot of things has to be sacrificed. In the area where my grandma lives, there has been a lot of development projects that are focusing on changing and replacing the areas of the old to make way for the new. Meaning a lot of older apartment blocks that were sadly quite badly maintained or had just been aging through time are being torn down and being replaced with newer buildings. And basically people living in these areas have to move out. And usually they are compensated, but they will basically lose their access to the place where a majority of their lives has been spent. But at the end of the day, deeply connected local communities are being separated. Areas that remind us of a past in China that was very different is basically gone, and all what remains is basically just memories. These areas are also surrounded by walls in order to hide them away because they don't really fit the image of modernity. However, for me, there's something beautiful about them. They really have some type of personality, some type of character to them that was forged by the ages and the years. And even though they're quite run down and really ripe for a touch-up, they still mean something. But sadly, they just don't fit the direction where these macro guidelines and big urban plans are heading towards. And I guess that's just how gentrification goes, not just in China, but globally speaking. What replaces these areas are the standardized buildings, standardized shopping, commercial areas, and the spectacular, grandiose constructions that can catch people's eyes. Big skyscrapers and glass buildings, huge malls with almost identical flooring and looks and aesthetics, exact one-on-one replicas of train stations. Hi kid. Good morning people, it's 7 a.m. here in China. It's so funny because all these like Chinese train stations look kind of the same. Metro stations, even the trains that run by kind of look the same. You'll probably bump into areas in Chengdu, Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen that will slightly look different but will definitely give you similar vibes. And honestly, even some cultural spaces will have a similar vibe. For example, Buddhist temples or imperial courts, they'll all have a similar type of polished aesthetic that were created by renovations of those areas. Oh my God. So as you can see through my eyes, in chase of modernity, convenience, and commercialization, we can very easily lose uniqueness. And it's crazy to think that amidst all this innovation that is happening in China, that created food serving robots in hotels. Guys, this is just so cool. I just ordered food from Meituan, which is like the Uber Eats equivalent like China. In hotels, they put the food into this robot thing and it will deliver it in a bit. And there's this small TV telecom thing that notified me that the robot received my food and now it's bringing it. What the fuck? This is so sick. What the fuck? This is so sick. On the street power bank stations so your phone can never die on the go. Super apps with a well-integrated payment system so you can pay for your taxi, your train, your flights, your hotels all in one go. And just a general direction within the economy towards high-tech developments, we can still end up with identically looking homogenized urban spaces where standardization is the name of the game instead of creating innovative new designs because of the prioritization of value production above anything else. And the reason why I'm bummed out about this is not because I'm like some hippie who likes to look at pretty things with history and they're quirky, but because these developments have a huge impact on the integrity of local cultures. So with all the standardization, what happened to them? Well, the hard part in homogenizing and developing areas is that who is to decide what is heritage and what is just old and replaceable? Just like my grandma's area that is getting gentrified. Is it rightful to demolish those buildings and create new spaces for new urban developments and potentially even house more people? Or can those be counted as social and economic heritage since it's a local community with certain type of income backgrounds and demographics that have been living there for ages, creating an ecosystems is quite interesting for historical and also cultural standpoints. Because through these development projects, what happens is that these local communities are being separated, and those old dynamics that kept those cultural values or certain traditions or certain local specificities are all gone now. And even cultural heritage sites like certain Buddhist temples or imperial courts, they're all polished up. They're all renovated to the point when they seem kind of new and made, which again is quite debatable because we want to renovate them in order to preserve them. But then with all the renovation, all the touch-ups, they kind of lose that character that they had to showcase that they had some kind of historical significance. And a lot of these renovations not only happen just to preserve those given areas, but they build commercial hubs around them. There are certain ancient streets and vendor markets that got turned into current style commercialized hubs, which is all about consumption and purchasing and selling goods. They also become some kind of a spectacle, something that you can enjoy as a consumer, as a tourist, but they kind of lose the substance that made that space special. This dilemma between of deleting the old and putting up the new, while also preserving heritage and determining what's worthwhile heritage, is quite tough and really brings up a lot of issues and questions that the state has to think about and needs to design very delicate policies around them. But making good decisions is not impossible. And a good example is what I've seen in Chongqing. You know, Chongqing, the place that is called the Cyberpunk city, it became quite big on IG with like the train going through the building, huge swirling streets, one on top of other, really deep metro stations. I was looking for the metro station, now somehow ended up at this like bed linen / like clothing store. These like floor planning also is so weird. Look at this, like it seems like we're not that high up, right? Like let me show you guys something. We're actually fucking, I don't know how many stories tall. Look at this. Chongqing is an interesting case study because it also had its own fair share of gentrification. The local government, in order to make the city a bit more luxurious, more modern, they had to demolish traditional vertically dense buildings, which resulted in the displacement of quite a few residents. They also approved construction plans for buildings like the Raffles City, which was made by a Singaporean real estate developer, building a building that is quite similar to the Marina Bay in Singapore. Marina Bay is quite a big symbol for Singapore in terms of showing off modernity, and I'm pretty sure Chongqing also wanted to build a building like that in order to have the same type of symbolism. But this construction project also resulted in the enragement of the locals. Either way, it was still built due to this wave towards modernity. But even with these similar urban development plans that other Chinese cities would also have, Chongqing had one problem, which is its own geography. The city is built upon mountains. It has a lot of vertical structures that other places would not have. Because it's such a hilly place, it creates this like sensation of like you can find different hidden gems across the city. You basically have to peel down each layer of the city and slowly explore it all. Chongqing's topography is breaking a quite common idea within the urban development literature. Most people usually think in a horizontal paradigm, meaning that they always think of the city as a flat surface, and the only vertical structures that are in there are usually big skyscrapers and towers. And the reason why a lot of urban structures usually try to replicate each other is because of the dominance of this horizontality. Because as soon as urban developers think of how can we inject verticality in a very flat area, they will just think of building high-rises. However, in a city like Chongqing, where verticality is already part of the nature of its existence, the imagination around how to build out the urban spaces becomes a little different. Chongqing had to develop its own unique vertically dense architecture and urban design in order to suit the topography that they have. And this doesn't mean that they don't create spectacular, grandiose structures. You can even just think about Hongyadong, which was back in the day was a fortress and later down a working class stilt house complex. But in 2005 got renovated and got made into this well-lit up touristic spot with a lot of places for food, fun, other cultural activities, and obviously taking a lot of photos. That is for the tourist eye to see. Its old historical meaning got put aside, but it's still an amazing piece of architecture because of the fact that it had to adapt to the given landscape. Even with the renovation, they kept the stilt house structure that reflects how architecture basically adapted to the given natural environment. And that is something unique. So uniqueness is still achievable even with the wave of standardization and the creation of spectacles. And the conditions to create creativity within urban design not only comes down to having a vertical terrain. Other Chinese cities should also consider dropping the horizontal paradigm and not only thinking flat surfaces, because in this case they might even come up with new creative solutions in terms of making very unique structures and designs that could still fit in the guidelines of standardization and the creation of commercially viable spectacles. And as I know, the government is already making steps towards consulting local communities in order to determine what is important culturally for them to be preserved. And in this way, local governments will have a much better view on what can count as heritage and what doesn't. And this consultation with local communities and also thinking in new paradigms might be very important for the future in terms of those areas that haven't seen modernization yet. Because even with the guidelines and the plans, there still will be areas within China that are not as economically developed and don't have enough funding yet to recreate the entirety of how their urban structure looks like. But when the execution of development in these areas start to happen as well, it might be very beneficial if local communities are already consulted. And I really hope urban policies can be reshaped around local communities and the preservation of culture. Because even throughout my brief time in China, I tasted so many different kind of amazing cuisines, spoke to locals and heard local dialects. And seeing regional specialities of culture that only exist there. And these things need to be preserved because all these small cultural elements add up to the entirety of what Chinese culture is. And all those centuries old ideas, thoughts, socio-cultural elements just needs to be preserved. Okay, so by now you probably have already made up your mind, your conclusions, your takeaways about China. Maybe I've already prepared a hate comment that like, oh, China sucks. But let me tell you, this is not only a problem in China. Homogenization and standardization is kind of a phenomenon across the world. And it's because of globalization and the expansion of neoliberal economic policies. Under neoliberalism, privatization, minimal government intervention, and also the free flow of capital and labor is the name of the game. Money, investment, and economic growth will flow to those places where investors, expats, talented workforces feel safety, stability, and a great outlook for the future. That is why, similar to China, a lot of urban spaces, especially the ones in third world countries, want to resemble modernity. They want to showcase that their cities or even their countries will be part of the modern future. That's why they also go with the mentality of out with the old and in with the new. Destroy everything that resembles that oldness, the chaos, the non-developed nature of the country. Build urban spaces that resemble what developed countries would deem as developed. So basically the standards of modernity becomes what Western countries deem as modern. Because what Western developed countries is where all the capital and talent is concentrated at. And in order to attract that, you will have to create environments that are luxurious, have those glass buildings, the skyscrapers, the tech hubs that show a better future. You have to have the same global brands like McDonald's, Starbucks, Louis Vuitton that anyone would recognize and feel some kind of familiarity towards. Create commercial hubs where things could be consumed that you could consume even at home. So you will feel a level of comfort while being there as a global citizen. And we can clearly see these processes right now in the Middle East with Dubai and many cities in Saudi Arabia like Riyadh, but even places like Singapore or China. These global processes and the expansion of global capital do bring together people. I'm also a child of that, of immigration, of globalization. And this can drive forward innovation, economic growth, social mobility for countries and cities that did not have the same privilege throughout history as Western countries. But with rapid urbanization and a chase towards modernity, there's a cost to pay, which is the loss of local communities and their cultures. Some of the unique characteristics of cities that were built throughout history might be nullified for the sake of modernity. So yeah, bro, it's quite depressing. I know what we're gonna do. I guess we are just going to merge into a big blob of like non-cultured species. Well, at the end of the day, history brings character, and the next generations will be the one who redefine their spaces and what they mean. And as I was seeing the new youth cultural hubs across Shanghai and Chengdu, I think young people are heading into a pretty promising direction. For example, the TX Mall in Shanghai, they have a very distinct young, youthful vibe, both in terms of interior design, the people who are hanging out there, the styles and the clothes that were sold there. There was just a certain different atmosphere, which I think what malls in China should head towards. They need to create their own unique vibes. There's also a street called Changlelu in Shanghai, which is filled with bars and cafes, creating an ecosystem for youth culture to flourish. And that street is pretty fun. I had a little drink there and the vibes, the atmosphere was impeccable. And even the massive clubs, for example, the place called Inns in Shanghai.
That whole little building is basically a clubbing slash drinking slash party complex. It's like apparently the Disneyland for adults. It's massive, mate.
There's also a hub for youth culture, an actual physical urban space that is designated for young people to have fun. So it's again a space that young people shape and give cultural meaning to it. And even the different kind of drinking games that people play, the way how they meet each other, to connect with other people, is just so unique to that given youth culture that is flourishing now in China. And these are the cultural elements that the next generations can bring into their urban spaces that can lead to a future where balance between a drive towards economic outputs and modernity could be created alongside cultural preservation. So hopefully this balance is something that the future holds, not just in China, but across the world. And thanks guys for watching. Please share any thoughts that you would think about the Chinese issue or homogenization and standardization across the world. And if you haven't done so yet, please subscribe, especially if you're interested in political, economic, or more socio-cultural topics like this. So until the next video, peace!